Air transport's climate-harming emissions have grown substantially from year to year over decades, and, with the exception of 2020, they are likely to continue to do so. This is due to the absence of intensive and focused action to wean the sector away from its dependence on fossil fuels and towards making its requisite contribution to the climate imperative. The tourism industry is increasingly cognizant of the aviation emissions issue, regarding it as the Achilles heel of the industry, and is elementally concerned. In June 2020, the World Travel Market, with Harold Goodwin of the Responsible Tourism Partnership, Chris Lyle of Air Transport Economics, and Paul Peters of Breda University of Applied Sciences, hosted a symposium bringing together a group of leading experts to address the problem of how to decarbonize aviation. A wider-ranging interview was kindly agreed to by award-winning geneticist and broadcaster David Suzuki. Canadian scientist and environmental activist David Suzuki is widely recognized as a world leader in sustainable ecology. From 1979, he became familiar to audiences around the world as host of CBC's TV's The Nature of Things, which still airs new episodes, including one entitled Rebellion, in November 2020. In which Dr. Suzuki collaborated with Sir David Attenborough on a roundup of global youth movements, such as Greta Thunberg's Fridays for Future. In 1990, Dr. Suzuki co-founded the David Suzuki Foundation, a science-based non-profit environmental organization with a history of success in promoting solutions to pressing environmental problems. Dr. Suzuki has long been concerned with climate change, with portions of his foundation's The Declaration of Interdependence, published in lead-up to the 1992 United Nations Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, being woven into the Earth Charter, which continues to gain adherents today. In this hard-hitting interview, now edited down to 20 minutes to focus on the air transport context, Dr. Suzuki addresses his concern over the uncontrolled contribution of humanity to climate change, stressing that climate-harming emissions need real and dramatic reductions, by no means least in those from aviation.
It's a real pleasure, David, that you've made time to talk with us. As you know, we are trying to encourage the UK travel and tourism industry and the travel and tourism industry internationally to pressurize the aviation industry to rapidly adopt non-polluting forms of flying. So the more impassioned you can be today about the need to strip carbon emissions out of the process of travel and tourism, the better. But I'm going to hand over to Chris. Thank you very much for your time this morning. Chris.
Good morning, David. If I may call you that, I always think of you as Dr. Suzuki, but and thank you so much for doing this. It really is wonderful that you found the time in your busy schedule to do this for us. I know that you and your foundation, the David Suzuki Foundation, are very much concerned about the impact of aviation on climate change, highlighting that a quarter of all carbon emissions globally could be from flying by 2050. Unlike ground transportation, air transport presently has no substantive alternative to fossil fuels. In the short term, you recommend flying economy, taking non-stop flights, taking daytime flights, choosing airlines carefully, and buying gold standard offsets. What do you think should be done about the long term? To what extent do you think the world should invest in expensive new technology and alternative fuels rather than reducing or limiting growth in flying?
In order to answer your question, I first have to establish where I'm coming from. I'm at the end of my life. I mean, I'm now way past my best before date, and I know that I'm on. I'm grateful for every year I get, but I'm at the end of my life, so I have no stake in the status quo, and I have no stake in the David Suzuki Foundation. I had to resign from the staff in order to escape our Prime Minister's wrath, and so I no longer have a stake. My only stake is in my grandchildren. That's the only thing that I care about. So that's where I'm coming from. Whether or not aviation survives or not is of no consequence for me. Whether or not there are, what will happen to the tourism industry is of no consequence to me. I just know at this point that we have a crisis that is coming from the human contribution to the atmosphere. The atmosphere is what gives us air to breathe, that gives us weather, climate, and the seasons. And we have become so powerful, we have altered the chemistry of the atmosphere. Even if we were to stop all emissions today, the ramifications of what we've already done are going to reverberate around the planet for decades, if not centuries. So we've already started the change. For me, the critical thing is we've got to stop contributing to what is causing these enormous shifts. We have no idea what we've already added is going to do in terms of the big things like the thermohaline movement of temperature, from Antarctic up. This is a major impactor, is the cold coming up from Antarctica, and that's being affected. And so to me, we are in a situation where the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in 2017, when did they come out? 2018 came out and said, we've got to get off fossil fuels very, very quickly, and 50% by 2030 and 100% by 2050. This is a challenge. We've got to get off fossil fuels. So when I hear about e-fuels and biofuels and all of that, those are not meeting the issue of we've got to stop our emissions. And aviation, it seems to me, has a special place that we haven't even assessed. The contribution to the atmosphere already starts way above the air that we're breathing down here. What is going to be the impact of those high-level emissions accumulating over time? I don't think we have any idea what that's going to be. So I start this whole conversation with the fact that we have to get off contributing to a crisis that's already started. Okay, that's my position. So what you're asking about is, what do I see for the future of aviation? Quite frankly, I have no idea. And believe me, I have flown far beyond anything I should ever have done as a single human being. And I'm looking back now and going, my God, why was I? Well, so much of our infrastructure is now built around flying and dependent on flying. But this is the challenge, is that whatever the technology is, and the same thing comes from windmills and solar panels and Tesla cars. All of these are still energy intensive. They may use the right kind of energy, but it takes energy and it takes mining to dig up the resources. So we have to look at everything in terms of our impact, not just on the atmosphere, but on the ground as well. We are living far beyond the capacity of this planet to sustain us in the manner that we're used to. It can't go on. This, to me, is the challenge. For the aviation industry, it's how do we do that? It's not about reducing your footprint. Yes, of course, those things have to be done. But in the long run, that footprint has to be reduced to zero in terms of emissions.
Harold, I asked you to be passionate, and I think we've recognized that. One of the things that's happening right now is that in Europe in particular, a number of countries have adopted a target of carbon net zero by 2050 in Europe. And in fact, there are some airlines that have also adopted that in Europe. But bearing in mind your need for the very short-term action, I don't know what you feel about that, or should the ambition go further to carbon zero? And when rather than carbon net zero, and when would that carbon zero start, in your view?
Well, what the IPCC in their 2018 report did was to give us a lifeline in the sense that many of us think we're way beyond avoiding catastrophic climate change. But they gave us a timetable that I was shocked. They really said in 2018, if we reduce by 45% by 2030, then and 100% by 2050, that we could avoid climate chaos. I don't believe that for a minute, but at least they gave us, they're the authorities, so I'm going to hope that they are absolutely right. What it says is we've got to get off the emissions of carbon, and it's very, very fast. And now it has taken a child, a teenage child, to cut through all of the baffle gap and say, look, I'm only a child, but I've learned that you have to listen to the science. What are the scientists saying? And then what are they saying we have to do? We're at a moment when I think that message is cutting through. So that's the challenge for everyone. Aviation is just one of them. Tourism, of course, is going to be hugely impacted if we're serious about trying to avoid an absolute catastrophic future.
Can I bring it back a bit to aviation then, and what can be done in the shorter term? One of the possibilities that is emerging is something called power to liquid e-fuels, and those could be made quite significant in 5 years, and governments could then establish a blending mixes, and saying that, you know, in 5 years' time, X% of the fuel has to be from a low carbon power to you're already.
I mean, it doesn't make any sense because you got emissions at the end. Yeah. You've got emissions at the end, you know, and with biodiesel, for example, as well, you say, well, we get the carbon absorbed by plants and then convert that, but the carbon ultimately gets back in the air. So that's not a solution. What it may do, because of a reduced short-term footprint, is provide you with a way of making a transition. But the fact is, it's not a solution any more than carbon offsets, which I've been using for over 10 years. All that does is salve my conscience, you know, and let me feel a little bit better about all the flying I'm doing. But that's not reducing the emissions.
Yeah, but in fact, power to liquid could reduce almost to zero emissions, as long as it's properly designed. It uses green power, and you've got already in Squamish, just north of you, there's somebody working on power to liquid, drawing from the atmosphere. In Montreal, we got one drawing from smokestacks.
Right.
And it could reduce emissions literally to zero if you could get.
No, but I'm sorry. Are you talking about burning hydrogen or using hydrogen? Because no. Otherwise, what comes out of the exhaust of the machines that use that? No, what's the emission?
Yeah, not hydrogen per se. And I saw Paul raising his hand, so if you won't mind, I'll just ask him to have a word on that one.
The issue is, you're completely right. If you look at biodiesel, and the problem is, of course, that chlorophyll, that's the beautiful green stuff plants are made of, is very inefficient in converting solar energy into something we could use and then burn again, and then again have emissions back into the atmosphere that were assumed to be taken from the atmosphere by the plants, of course. So you might reduce the emissions, but certainly not get them back to zero. However, in the alternative, say, fuels discussion, we have two completely different types of fuel, and the one is the biofuels. Everyone is talking and thinking about that, and I agree, that's a dead alley. But the other one is the power to liquids that Chris just mentioned, and they work in a completely different way, because what you do there is you take carbon dioxide ultimately from the atmosphere, so it reduces. That goes into the factory with a lot of energy, and there you have a point. The energy is actually the main issue we should reduce, and that could go back to our behavior. But anyway, if you have the renewable energy, that's zero emissions. So of course not from a power plant on coal, but something with solar, hydro power or wind energy, that sort of sources. And you add some water, then you can reverse the whole burning process and make a fuel out of it. And of course, if you burn the fuel, it gets back into the atmosphere, but then at least you have closed the cycle. So it's not adding to the atmosphere. It's also not reducing the amount in the atmosphere. So for that purpose, it's no good, but at least it stops digging up the oil for making the kerosene. So that's the idea of the e-fuels. If you do it in the right way, and that of course is a big if, with politicians that not always take the right measures to make the if work. But if you do it in the right way, then potentially, pure technologically, it can reduce to zero emissions, that the net emissions are zero, because you take the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by the factory and the aircraft brings it back, and then it goes back to the factory, in theory.
You've got hydrogen, for God's sake. If anything, hydrogen has got to be a way to go. And of course, there's got to be a huge breakthrough before solar is at all even feasible for any long trips. But, you know, that's the challenge that the industry has got to meet if it wants to stay in business. That's of no concern to me. I'm not interested in that.
Mm-hmm. You're right, indeed, that hydrogen is the key for every solution in aviation. And even in e-fuels, hydrogen is the key. But in the end, we make something that the current aircraft can use, because, yeah, otherwise, indeed, we have to ground all the aircraft that are there. But that's a trillion or a zillion of investments that will not go away.
I actually saw you marching in the Fridays for Future march in Montreal on your way to join Greta Thunberg on the podium, and there were a lot of young people there. But what message do I pass on to my grandchildren?
I have 9 grandchildren. My youngest ones are twins. They're now 2.5 years old. I was holding them. They have been the joy of my life. I was holding them one night. They were about 7 or 8 months old. And I suddenly began to weep. And my wife and daughter grabbed the children and went, Dad, what's wrong? What's wrong? And then I wailed. This has never happened to me in my life, because I realized really deeply that the things I've been saying as an environmentalist, they aren't just warnings. It's happening. These children don't have a chance at growing up in a world that is anything like the one I grew up in as a child. They haven't got a chance of living out a full, rich life. And to realize that, I was inconsolable at that moment. But that's the reality that we've created. And we've used so many things to justify what we're doing in the status quo to keep things going. And the biggest one has been the economy. They have fought for decades against accepting the danger, the reality of climate change, to keep that fossil fuel industry going. And we've got all kinds of ways, you know. Sure, you can look at your grandchildren and say, Grandpa's really doing hard. We're working hard on aviation, and we're going to reduce the emissions and use e-fuels and all of that stuff. Fine, great. If you can live with that, go for it. The reality is, for me, these kids don't have a chance. They don't have a chance because we're unwilling to do the hard things that are going to have to be done. There is a cartoon called Roadrunner. Do you know Roadrunner in Europe?
Yes, I remember that.
A little bird that runs along.
Yeah.
So Roadrunner is being chased by Wile E. Coyote. And always Roadrunner escapes, and Coyote, gets into a terrible situation. So Roadrunner is being chased by Wile E. Coyote. They come to the edge of a cliff. Roadrunner turns 90 degrees and misses it. Wile E. Coyote's got so much momentum, he's right over the edge. And there's that moment when he goes, oh my God, I'm over the edge of the cliff. And then down he goes. We're there. That's where we don't still have a chance to turn left or turn right. We're over the edge. That doesn't mean you have to stop. It makes a big difference whether you fall 500 feet or whether you fall 5 feet or 10 feet. And that's, I think, a perfect justification to say, look, we're over the edge, and I'm trying like mad to make the transition that is inevitable. It's coming.
You've done exactly what I hoped you would do, which is to make the case for the need for really rapid progress. And I think your analysis of the unwillingness of successive generations to deal with this is right on the button. So I just wanted to say a really big thank you.